So, thank you both for those tuning in or joining us. We're here talking with Eric Powell and Harold Schechter about Dr. Worthless, which is a fantastic graphic novel about Frederic Wertham, who in comics people will know him as the person that tried to destroy the industry and censor the industry. But as the graphic novel shows, there's way more to him, and we're going to dive into that because I found that to be the most fascinating thing about the whole graphic novels. Because I just know just a small little bit of his history. But before we get there, so you also did another graphic novel called "Did You Hear What Eddie Gain Done," which was fantastic. Both of these were absolutely wonderful graphic novels, and I can already tell you Dr. Worthless will be on my best of list when the year wraps up, just like Eddie Gain. But how'd you two get together? Because this is like a really fascinating thing of like these two books back to back.
Well, I had been a fan of Harold for decades. I'd read all of his books, just fascinated with true crime. And I was doing a book tour for the 20th anniversary of The Goon. I was going around to comic shops and doing signings and stuff. And I was in Wisconsin doing one. And because I was very familiar with Harold's book on Geen and that whole story kind of fascinated me as a kid because in my generation it wasn't Psycho, it was Texas Chainsaw Massacre that everyone went around and said, that's a true story. you know um so I'd always been fascinated with it, and I was like, I want to go to Plainfield. Um so while we were out there doing the signing, we drove up, and it was just I was kind of struck at how isolated it was out there. And I started thinking, like, wow, it'd be really cool to do a graphic novel on this case that um, focused on the solitude of the whole thing, and like how that contributed to his downfall and his psychological downfall. Um, but then, of course, I thought, Harold has already done the definitive book on this. There's nothing I could contribute, and if I did a book, I would just be swiping all this stuff from Harold's book. So I was like, nah, well, that's a bad idea. I'm not going to do that. But then I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I thought, well, maybe I could get in touch with Harold. Maybe it's been a while since he has uh, written that book. Maybe he has more insight. Maybe he's found out some things that didn't make it into the book. I thought, he'll never get back to me, but I'll give it a shot. And I tracked down his agent, and through him sent a message. And to my surprise, Harold knew who I was and immediately wrote back. And I was also a big comics fan, so was super enthusiastic about doing it.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. No, I mean, I was a huge fan of the Goon. I regard Eric, as he knows, as our nation's greatest comic book artist. So yeah, I was totally thrilled when he got in touch with me with the idea.
So it's an interesting thing. I want to talk about Eddie Gain really quickly. That graphic novel, it was one of the few graphic novels that I've read in comics in general that I actually had like a visceral difficulty getting through. I mean, it is so heinous, the stuff that's in it. While researching it and drawing it and putting that together, like, what was your reactions doing it? Like, it's a brutal, brutal book. Like, I remember actually having like getting nauseous at times because it's just so I like it. Yeah, I just don't even know how to describe it. Like it really is that level of brutality that is unimaginable.
Well, first of
Well,
all,
I'll give,
I want to,
yeah,
no, I
I
just,
was going to say, I'll give you my take, but Harold, what was your initial,
well, I'll
like
let
when you
you,
were originally doing this research, what was that like?
no, I'll let you speak. I just wanted to thank our host for the wonderful testimonial. how nauseous
Yeah.
the book made him, and how he could barely get through it. So yes, but otherwise, I'll turn it back over to you.
And it still made my best of list. So that
Oh
says,
yeah.
um, well, as far as my end of getting through the book, um it really didn't affect me all that much because it was almost like I was so wrapped up in getting little details right and things like that that I didn't. It was almost like doing writing a history paper or something.
Hmm.
Um, I didn't get uh, really deep into like Gein's. I didn't immerse myself. Like I didn't, that kind of thing where you're like if you're writing a piece of fiction, you got to kind of feel what the character feels and stuff like that. With this, it was almost like, well, what did he say and why did he say that?
Hmm.
It was more analytical than emotional, I guess. But like I did a book called Big Man Plans, and it takes place in the 70s. So there's a lot of dark songs from the 70s, really depressing songs. So I made this playlist and I listened to it while I was drawing the book, and it's a super hyper violent book. That really affected me and really depressed me. By the time I was done with it, it was, I just had to like, I want to draw freaking Smurfs or something. I don't know. I want to draw something light. Um, but yeah, this for whatever reason didn't really affect me emotionally.
Well, you probably knew the story. I mean, when I first wrote the
Yeah,
book, which is, quite a while ago, that all the material is so shocking to me. Uh, in my early books, I did get often very affected, especially my second book about the one about Albert Fish. Um, but, I always tell people compare my experience to that of, let's say, a first year medical student. The first couple of times they dissect a cadaver, it's really, really hard. And after a while, they're just eating lunch while they're doing it. So, but yeah, but the Geen stuff. When I was composing the original book Deviant, it definitely gave me a few nightmares, no question about it. But by the time I was collaborating with Eric, I mean that was like 30 years later or something.
yeah,
Uh, so by then the story was just another story.
do you think there's a difference between like the original prose book and then the graphic novel? Because the graphic novel puts, visuals to it,
Mm-hmm.
which has to hit a little bit different as far as like what he did and really like drive home what he did. Like there's one thing reading the page and using, imagining it, and there's another seeing those visuals.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, I've said this before. Eric will be familiar with this. It's just that as you were saying, when you're reading a book, you're doing the visualization. But, when Eric does it, he's like visualizing better than anybody else could do. So, I felt that, his artwork just enhanced the whole book.
yeah. You can write a sentence, but to be smacked in the face with a drawing of it is something else. So you have to kind of, walk a fine line there too.
Yeah. So I feel like this is a good transition. Speaking of violence in comics, so Frederic Wertham, how did this graphic novel come about? Like, what was the collaboration, and how did you decide on Wertham being kind of the next topic?
Eric, you have a very vivid.
Okay. Well, we were as soon as we finished the Geen book, we were both kind of like, let's do another one. So we had gone back and forth with a few ideas, and Harold was actually here in Portland for a some promotional uh, signing or something that we were doing, and we were crossing the street to the venue, And he just said, "What about Frederic Wertham?" And that's all he had to say. 'Cause, I was familiar through Harold's work, and Wertham is a pretty prominent figure in a couple of his books. So I was familiar with Wertham from, the his involvement, not just in comics, but the the criminal aspect of it. Um, and I just thought that it really encompasses everything. You have, comic book history, true crime, civil rights, all of these components that are, don't seem like they mesh, but through Wortham, they all come together. And I just thought it'd be a fascinating thing to try to tackle all of those.
Yeah. Um, I'd been thinking about doing a biography of Wortham for a long time because, as Eric suggests, I'd, become familiar with his psychiatric work through some books I'd written. I too I'd known about Wortham from my adolescence. A cousin of mine who was very wonderful, but, high-minded, high culture kind of person had a copy of Wortham's book in her library because she basically agreed with everything he said. And when I came across it, I borrowed it. That's in air quotes. um, uh, so I basically had known Wortham, again, as most people do, as a scourge of the comic book industry, this
Yeah.
kind of Carrie Nation-like, Blue Nose, who was very censorious, et cetera, et cetera. I'd come to discover, as I said, a different dimension to him while writing my book on Albert Fish and another book about the mad sculptor Robert Irwin. As I said, at one point, I had this idea of writing a biography about him. Um, so it was always on the back of my mind. And then after the wonderful collaboration with Eric, I just thought that might be a book that, we could do well together.
So like I knew the comic aspect of it, the seduction of the innocents and the hearings and all that. As I think I said in my review, I interned on the Hill for a while, worked on the Hill for a while, and I remember walking in on the tour for the internship, and they took us into the hearing room where that happened, and that was what was mentioned was like, hey, for those who might know this happened in this room, and I immediately like it hit me of just like, oh, this history that's around. Um, for you all, what kind of surprised you about Wortham? Like, for those who don't know, like this isn't a person who's just a psychologist, psychiatrist that went and attacked the comic industry. As you say, like he was involved in these true crime, some rather famous true crime incidents. He was involved in, Brown versus Board Education, the civil rights fight, which like completely surprised me. I had no idea his involvement. I mean, it was, I think as you kind of showed in the graphic novel, like he's a very complicated, more layered individual than probably a lot of people know or give credit for.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've answered the question in a way because, speaking for myself, and I think it's probably also true of Eric, I just had no idea as much as I knew about Wortham. And I had previously been to the Library of Congress to research some of his material. Uh, but, I had no idea of the depth of his involvement with civil rights, the full extent of his involvement in what was called the Lafargue Institute, this psychiatric clinic in Harlem,
Yeah.
that offered, the underprivileged residents psychiatric treatment, for like 25 cents, nothing if they couldn't even afford the quarter. I guess what I learned about Wortham was, and I hope the graphic novel makes it clear, that he was basically this very liberal, even progressive humanitarian person. Some of the things we discovered were these very sympathetic letters to this tormented gay guy who wrote to him. Um, he wasn't this blue nose censor. We discovered documents showing at the time, Elvis Presley was regarded in many places of the country, as a threat to the morality of American youth and so on and so forth. He said Elvis Presley was fine. There was a case in which the publisher of a nudist magazine, back then, if you wanted to get a real skin rag, you got these nudist health magazines, because they had unretouched photos of women completely naked and so on. And this guy was being persecuted or prosecuted, I guess I should say, well, maybe both, for sending these things through the mail on obscenity charges. And Wertham came to his defense. He didn't see anything wrong with the naked man and woman. So he wasn't, again, this, he's lumped together with McCarthy,
Yeah.
and all of, and, the guy who started the Hays Code in Hollywood, and all of these other censors, who have come down on different aspects of American culture throughout our history. But he wasn't like that at all. His whole obsession was the cause of violence. The other thing we learned was that he literally felt that murder and violence and warfare could be eliminated, from the world. If the right social conditions prevailed, he became convinced, largely through his work with Kids in Little Far Clinic, that these violent crime comics were having this very nefarious effect on kids.
Where do you think his?
What, can I interrupt?
Yeah, sorry.
I dominated that answer. I'd like to know, but ask.
No.
Answered by
Your answers are always much better than mine would be anyway, so I'm fine to let you dominate the answer. No, I think for myself, the most surprising thing was finding out how like protective of his own personal life he was. It was extremely hard for us to find any material about his personal life, and he, we found some correspondence between him and some people, some people he was debating about comics, and they would ask him some things about his personal life, and he was like, "I'm not discussing that." And we know that he was estranged from his family for some reason, but he's a very guarded man when it came to his personal life.
By the way, before you,
Yeah.
I just want to interject one other point that's very important to emphasize, which is that, the book was really co-written by Eric and me. No,
Yes.
I want to make that, because, Eric is a comic book artist, but as anybody who's read the Goon knows, he's an amazing writer. So
yeah, I made a joke a few days ago online because there were a couple of reviews that mentioned Harold as the author and myself as the artist. And I think Harold's worried about it now. He's like, doesn't want me to be offended. It's just
no, but it's also
care.
true.
You got to credit, right? Like, yeah, credit things right.
Yeah.
So that was something that I thought was interesting in the book is he seems to be very focused on violence. Like he had this interaction with these murderers before. He seemed to kind of really want to dive in and figure out what caused this. And I thought it was interesting that he didn't seem to care so much about sexuality, nudity, and was more overall he was very sympathetic for everyone. I think you really kind of laid that out and showed that really well, is that he did care about his patients, even if it was just a fascination to try to solve these issues in some way. Um, the one question I had though, I thought was interesting, that I don't think necessarily the graphic novel dove into, or maybe you don't even know the answers, is he clearly thought entertainment, violence entertainment can create violence in the real world. Did he have the same feelings about sexuality and nudity when it came to entertainment impacting the real world, or did he also feel like that wasn't a big enough deal that you needed to do anything about it?
yeah, I mean, he obviously, you see in the correspondence with that gay guy,
Yeah.
he was what we now would call sex positive.
Hmm.
So he didn't see anything unhealthy about, it's not like I'm sure he'd have different feelings if he were watching Pornhub, and seeing some woman get choked.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but,
If he
but
could look at today's world, he'd be very upset.
yeah, those nudie magazines, which again felt they were, well, it's a lot of hypocrisy going on there, but they were sort of promoted as health magazines and so on. No, I mean, if you treat Albert Fish, your life view is going to change in terms of the human, in terms of violence and what causes violence.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if it's still in effect, but in the 30s in New York City, every convicted murderer uh, had to be examined by these psychiatrists from Bellevue, who would then provide a report to the judge that would supposedly have some influence on the sentencing. So, as a professional psychiatrist, Wertham was totally immersed in, in violence and the causes of violence, and he, well, although had traditional psychoanalytic training, knew everything that there was to know about Freudian theory. He actually had been mentored by a different psychiatrist who emphasized social and environmental factors, more than infantile complexes.
Yeah.
So, this was all reinforced when he was running the Lafargue Clinic and interviewing these young, very troubled black kids. And the one thing they seemed to have in common was they all read these violent comics. Um, so, a few things to be said for that. A, a lot of the comics back then were seriously inappropriate for young readers. We blame him for destroying the EC horror comics, but to say those were the cream of the crop is an understatement. 99.9% of them were horrifically, grotesquely sadistic and violent. The other thing was that, he came to fame at a time when there was this moral panic about juvenile delinquency. There was a poll back at that time in which the American public ranked juvenile delinquency, as a public threat, second only to open atom bomb testing. And, but yes, the other thing which you suggest is he did have, for a complex man who had such a sophisticated understanding of the human psychology, he had a very surprisingly simplistic view of the relationship between reading these kinds of comic books and behavior. As you say, it was like, yeah. So he came to believe that a lot of kids were emulating, some of the horrible things that we're encountering in the comic.
Yeah, I think he had two major flaws. One, that outlook that, you know, uh violence isn't inherent to the human race. And um the other being that he thought he was never wrong. Um and I think those two things are why he kind of um tarred his own legacy.
Mm.
It's interesting. Like the thing that I found really fascinating, especially about his involvement in civil rights, is that it felt like he was so close to nailing it, right? Like he really was, I think, one of those early people who would admit that outside factors of poverty and policy and governments and all that
Mm-hmm.
impacts people psychologically, and that's going to drive a lot of behavior and how people act. And then he just like seems to get obsessed about comics, right? Like he talks to these kids who did these things, and the connections all comics, and as you've shown off, a lot of his conclusions were um, had issues with, he would overlook data and other little bits. But at the same time, like, I'm sure a lot of those people also had very similar socioeconomic and societal backgrounds that would have tied it together. I found it fascinating that he just focused on this one thing and seemed to ignore
Yeah.
ignore all the rest.
Well,
When
he
he was
didn't
so
really.
close on us, all these other, dealing
Yeah.
with it in so many other ways.
Well, he didn't ignore all the rest. I mean, one of the reasons he was so active in the civil rights movement, is because he understood, how racism was affecting, the psychology of all these kids.
Yeah.
But, there's some weird mystery about Wortham, where he seemed really, well, he was kind of obsessed with comic books. And you almost detect underneath that, his attack on them, some defense, against his own attraction to them, and the pleasure he got from them. It's what the Freud would call a reaction formation, like homophobia classically. It's because secretly, you have this erotic attraction to men.
Mhm.
This is like comic phobia, but, secretly, you're kind of attracted to all that stuff. And one reason I think he might have been attracted to it is, Wortham was part of the generation of the social class, very highbrow, very cultured. He married this, very prominent sculptor, and the house was filled with modern art, which, by the way, Eric beautifully captures elements of that in the graphic novel. But secretly, you know, there is something about this pulp culture, that's really kind of providing him with experiences and feelings and fantasies, that you don't get from going to opera all the time.
Mhm.
You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, to some extent, again, I'm playing armchair psychoanalyst myself, but but there does seem to be something like that in the intensity, of his aversion to
Well,
comic books.
and he also put elements of, pulp in his own work,
Yeah.
with we go into a little detail on that in our book, but with Dark Legend. But yeah, I also wonder. I mean, there's no. It's again because it's hard to find any personal information or you know writing about his personal thoughts. But you know, I have to wonder too if the just this is my perspective, that he found he definitely liked attention. You can't deny that, but maybe with comics he found that niche where he was, getting invited onto radio programs and things like that. And maybe that had a little bit of a contributing factor to why he so, vehemently went after him.
Mm.
I
Yeah.
don't know.
So
Well,
that was
that.
actually going to be my next question. Was that like there is this kind of under.
Oh, I just want to add something to what Eric just said,
Yeah.
which is that Wortham didn't start the crusade against comic book.
No.
It was already going on. So just in support of Eric's previous point, yeah, I mean, there's something about Wortham hopping on this bandwagon, and again, he'd already, he was already a pretty prominent media figure, but this really put him in the spotlight. So yeah, that's definitely another factor.
And that was going to actually be my next question was like I got a sense that he clearly had, I don't know if you want to call it like an inferiority complex, but he felt like he wasn't getting necessarily the respect that he deserved.
Hmm.
It needs to be an ongoing theme. And I could, my always belief is that a lot of the demagoguery, and you see it today, is that people maybe start with something with good intentions and starts getting the spotlight and the recognition and rolls with it and has to ramp it up further and further and further, to kind
Mm.
of keep it up. Did I mean, you show that like he wrote was wanted to do like a movie and wound up being a play or all that. Like it seems that he clearly wanted recognition just beyond what he was doing work wise.
Mhm. Well, I
Um,
think you're right. I mean, he it's always complicated, I think, when you are elevated to the role of this kind of public intellectual.
yeah,
I think you're right. He didn't receive any respect from his scientific peers. In fact, there were many, many, it wasn't that everybody was agreeing with Wertham at the time of his crusade. There were plenty of people, both psychiatrists and, scientists who questioned his data, and many, many literary critics. When I was many years ago in graduate school, my mentor was a famous critic who had written very dismissive articles about Wertham's work and accusing him of having no understanding of how stories and literature and narratives really affect the human imagination. It's not like you read something and then go do it. But so yeah, you're right. I mean, he didn't have the respect of a lot of his professional peers. Many of them just regarded him, as this kind of showboating pop psychologist. So,
Yeah, and one of the areas, I mean, he was really affected by this, the way he was kind of swept under the rug when it came to his contribution to segregation
mm,
and to ending segregation. Um, again, I mean, we don't have any solid evidence. Nobody was in the room with these people when they were having, the discussions of who to include in these cases and stuff like that. But um, the judge himself states that Wertham's testimony was a major factor in him deciding to end, school segregation, and yet Wertham wasn't included when this was taken to the Supreme Court, and he was very upset about that, very, very bitter about it.
mm,
So he's definitely I don't know. You can. It's understandable that you would be bitter, but obviously he was rubbing people the wrong way. In a lot of these cases.
mm,
yeah, the segregation part was to me the most surprising aspect of the entire book. Like I had no idea his involvement, let alone like that's what the judge quoted. Like I've never connected the
Mhm.
two.
mm,
And then yeah, I got the sense that like it was like he just had this personality that rubbed people the wrong way. Like it
Yeah,
seemed to start from a very early time, and that seemed to kind of play in and almost like spiral throughout his career to
Mhm.
this point of like I want my respect, I want my recognition towards the end.
I
yeah,
think that's really the overall point of the book.
Yeah.
Is how he should be remembered as this really noble figure in our history, and through his own failings, and he's kind of destroyed his own legacy.
It's tragic in a lot of ways, right? Like it's a kind of
Yeah.
a rather
yeah.
tragic story.
Yeah, it is a tragedy. I think that's what we were trying to, to make. But
Well, you
yeah.
succeeded then. Exactly. I came out of it was this, and that's kind of the next question. Is like when I went into it, there was this guy that I vilified that I thought was completely wrong. In a previous role, like I was, knee deep in the fight of video game censorship, which I saw was a lot
Mhm.
of echoes with the comic censorship,
Yeah.
including the bunk science. Um, And I only saw him as a villain, just like I see a lot of the other people that were railing against video games as villains. But coming out of this, like I had a lot of sympathy for, like I felt bad for him that like this dude is just kind of a prick in general and rubbed everyone the wrong way and just did not have the personality to work with people. But he
Oh
was
yeah, but
really
I mean, you can
Yeah.
intelligent.
I
yeah,
mean,
well, you can imagine like being, with a guy, this like hair doctor who spoke, I guess, with a German accent, and yeah, and this very prickly personality, who had a very strong sense of always being in the right. Yeah, you wouldn't want to be in a room with him, for sure. So, um, I'm sure that contributed to the whole thing. So, and
And,
again, a certain kind of self-righteousness.
yeah.
But that the thing is, he was a human. He was a human being. He was full of complexities.
Mhm.
And one of the reasons, I mean, one of the main reasons that I certainly wanted to do the book was, not to excuse his excesses, but to redeem his reputation in a way.
It's also interesting that he's this prickly guy. I think many people would call him a dick. Like he just was not a nice person to work with or be around, it seemed.
Mm-hmm.
But he also had lots of empathy and seemed to be very empathetic towards his patients.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was really interesting. Is like, to the average person, he was an ass, but to his patients, he seemed like the type of person you do want to go and talk to,
yeah,
lay things out, and that he
I
would,
think, yeah, I
be
was just,
kind.
I think that's the one area where you can't really question his character. He did care about his patients.
Well, I think
Um,
he cared. I think when you say, he was an asshole to people in general, that's a little bit of an exaggeration.
Yeah, but
He was like, again, as mentioned before, when you look at the correspondence between him and that very tormented
yeah,
gay guy, there was he was in many, many ways a very humane individual. The prickliness and the off-puttingness had most to do with his professional, uh, peers and so on and so forth. Not only not obviously not with his patients, but not necessarily, to the average person. You know what I'm saying?
yeah, we came across a lot of letters that he had written, correspondence between people who were debating him about comics. I guess this would have been around the 70s. And he was always polite in those correspondence with people.
Mm-hmm.
He never was like, "You're an idiot," anything like that. He would vehemently defend himself and sometimes walk around in, illogical circles of, you know, trying to defend himself. Uh, but he was never, rude to them. So,
is there something, going into it, is there something that kind of surprised you, or did your opinion change of Wortham by the time you were done with all this?
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, I just want to emphasize that Wortham, even with the comic book stuff, was not totally off base. And he was not calling, for the elimination, of anything like resembling violence or whatever. He was attacking them for their racism. He was attacking them because, look, I mean, the real villains in many of those cases were these incredibly sleazy comic book publishers, who were just turning out absolute lurid, sensationalistic junk, you know, that was unsuitable for young guys. So Wortham wasn't, again, totally off base. Um, his tone could become a little hysterical for sure. But it's important to remember, to keep that in mind. So,
Yeah,
yeah, I think some people when they hear about Wortham and all they hear is that he killed EC Comics, and they think the comic book industry was like it is today. Like it's just superheroes and it's kid stuff, but and Wertham was like, oh, this is evil. But the comic book industry at the time was just they were functioning off of a bunch of trends. Like there's a romance trend, there's a horror trend, but at the big thing that started, even before Wertham, this outcry against comics was that there was a crime trend. And a lot of these publishers were putting out material just to try to top the other guy. So
Yeah.
it's like make it even worse than that, So they're I mean, of course, I disagree because all of my work is violent and crime and horror. So, I'm like, let the kids read it.
Yeah, but your stuff is fun. Your stuff is fun, gratuitous horror and violence. But
But there is an argument to be made that some of it was not fit for kids.
yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
I disagree with that argument, but there is an argument to be made.
Do you
No, well. Anyway, let me just say another context in which is very important to put this, and that accounts, for the brilliant way that Eric decided to begin the graphic novel. So years ago, I wrote a book called Savage Pastime, a history of violent entertainment. And one of the points I make in the book is that every time a new medium of popular entertainment has come out, this is probably, going back pre-Victorian era, especially one that's aimed at a juvenile delinquent, a juvenile audience, is, it's been attacked, is this very, very insidious thing that's going to undermine the morality of American youth. In the graphic novel, we go back to the, story of the Boston boy fiend, Jesse Pomeroy, who's a juvenile sex killer. And when he was arrested, his crimes were blamed on he read too many violent dime novels.
Yep.
And if you go through, like, literally every time a new form of popular entertainment is introduced, movies, radio, obvious, when rock and roll came out. I'm old enough to remember, again, the kind of hysteria that was created, by Elvis Presley. And then more recently, violent video games. It's like, the Columbine killers played too many, played Red Dead Redemption too often or something. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
So in that sense, the comic book, anti-comic book crusade of the 1950s, was just one in another line of, I'm sure, in the future, and I hope to live to be able to experience it. Video games. Like, I always imagine, spending my last years hooked up to a virtual reality helmet, being fed by an IV tube, and playing some incredibly violent shooter game, and getting to feel the blood splatter on my face.
There'll be a moral panic about that.
Well, until when that happens, which it will, they're going to be people are going to be looking back fondly on the good old days, and kid plays, these innocent games, Grand Theft Auto, and so on and so forth.
Do you have a sense that it was the fact that these books were being read by kids that was the issue, and not necessarily the violence? Like let's say if the rating system today existed, and these were the EC comics were rated R, or X, or whatever, and weren't in the hands of kids, would he have had as much of an issue with it?
Well, it's hard to say, but yeah,
I don't know.
a lot of people, like, a major audience for comic book then were like soldiers and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of adults read them, but yeah, he was only talking about its influence on kids.
Yeah, it's hard to tell because he was pretty inconsistent with his messaging on this stuff. One minute he would say, you know, if it's not in the hands of kids, I don't care. And then the next sentence, he's saying these should be wiped out entirely because they make people stupid.
And that's kind of what I
And,
noticed too.
one minute he's saying the people that make comics aren't bad people, they're just, making bad things. And then the next minute he's comparing them to Nazis.
Yeah.
That his messaging was kind of all over the place in this stuff.
Do you think
But,
there's continue? Sorry.
no, just saying. Well, he wasn't also. Again, you have to look at some of those comics to see what Wertham was complaining about.
Yeah,
But he
I'm
also
not
didn't
saying
make
these
any.
are for
He didn't
kids.
really
Like
make
they're
any.
pretty violent stuff.
Well, they're beyond violent. Again, they were like so sadistic, some of them, and plus, they were just artistically and in terms of the writing, they were just crap. The thing with the EC comics is they got lumped in with all these other things.
Yeah.
So and the abhorrence of Wertham for having killed off the EC comics. There's some justice to that, but the EC comics were just the icing on this. Well, I can't even say icing on a cake. It's icing on this shit pile, or something.
Kind of the highest brow with the low brow.
Well, just EC comics are works of art.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at all of the comics made at that time, EC comics, if compared to everything, are, they still today you look at them. Look at all those Jack Davis covers and everything. They're still amazing. And then you can't say that about all comics from the 40s and 50s.
Well, you can't say the EC comics at that time. They're the only ones we knew who the artist was and who the writers were. I mean, that's the mark of something that's a significant piece of art.
Yeah.
The other.
Yeah, I guess they were doing that, the promoting the artist even before Stan Lee started
Yeah,
you
had to wait until
and all of that stuff.
Yeah, you had to wait. It didn't happen again until the Marvel comics.
Yeah,
and that's because the rest is just anonymous trash. But again, because of the violent content of so many of those. I mean, very infamously, the one that William Gaines held up in the committee hearing with the guy holding the decapitated woman's head. He just lumped them all in with the rest.
Yeah.
Do you find it at all? To me, there was some irony in the graphic novel in that it starts off really violent. You have these famous killers that Wertham worked with, and you go into some detail about all of that. And then to me, there was something almost humorous about it. This guy who was so violence, or at least were perceived to be so anti-violence, that the almost biography about him features a lot of violence.
Well, it was
Wait.
And it's people he worked with, right? It's real history and all that, and,
Yeah.
and you got to deal with it because it influenced him. But I mean, there's some irony on it.
He wasn't, to say he was anti-violence is a little too broad. I mean,
It's fair.
a lot of people are anti-violence. I mean, but he was very keenly aware, that criminal violence existed, often in very extreme forms, and he was, as a professional, convinced that environmental factors, had a lot to do with turning young people into violent criminals. And he himself, of course, one point we make in the book, I think Eric makes it very well, to some extent, what you're suggesting is an irony in our book. He himself wrote these books exploiting. He basically wrote these, very explicit true crime books.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were written supposedly and to some extent sincerely, as books exploring again the roots of violence, why these kids turned out this way, and so on and so forth. With an implicit argument that if those other factors could be eliminated, violence can be, homicidal violence could be eliminated. But people were just also reading them, for the cool, titillating crime stories. So that tension that exists maybe in our book is, I think, also reflective of what Wertham did.
I think one of the biggest ironies is that Wertham, one of his real fixations with comics were the depictions of violence towards someone's eye, like needles in the eye or something like that.
Mm.
And one of his biographers who did a comic book about him as a character whose catchphrase is knife to the eye.
Yeah.
So,
well, that's the other thing. Even
there's something I take a certain amount of satisfaction out of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even Seduction of the Innocent, one of the reasons you read it is for the cool illustrations.
The cool illustrations of needles
of,
in the eye.
women being tied to operating tables and having their blood drained out and stuff like that. Again, when you look at those images, you think, oh, well, maybe, Wertham was just being very selective and picking out the most extreme images. But in fact, images like that were pretty pervasive in the lower stratum of comic books back then.
Yeah.
What I've had you for a while, so I kind of want to start wrapping it up. Like, what for those who don't know much about Wertham and haven't read the graphic novel, and everyone should, because one, it's educational, but amazing art, very entertaining, like absolutely fantastic. As I said, absolutely going on my best of the year list. For those who haven't read it, like what to both of you, what would be the thing that really surprised you, or you think should be the biggest takeaway from it?
Hmm. I don't know. I think the his involvement in the criminal cases with like Albert Fish and um, the Mad Sculptor. Help me out here,
Yeah.
Robert Irwin. Um, I think those are the most surprising to me, but it's like it's an aspect that I don't think a lot of people know about.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you're, anybody in the world of comicdom who knows, who knows the name of Wertham and who would therefore immediately associate it, with all the negative things we've been talking about, I would think and hope, be kind of an eye-opening book about this man, who is many, many ways very, very admirable. And as you say, there are, I don't know if I'd say tragic, definitely poignant aspects of his life. He was a person who did these commendable things, but then ended up, his work discounted by the psychiatric community. Uh, he was very well aware of his villainous reputation among comic book fans. So yeah, there is well, I guess I would say kind of tragic dimension to
it. Definitely, I absolutely think it was tragic, and as I said earlier, is the thing that really got me about the graphic novel is like how sympathetic he comes off. Like you really do kind of feel bad for him in some ways, and that you know his personality and who he was really kind of led to a lot of the people calling him a villain and in many different ways. So I thank you. Like it was eye-opening, educational, as I said, entertaining, amazing art. Like you two are knocking it out of the park for both releases. So final question: is there a possible trilogy of books coming out? Are you all thinking that maybe what's next, and what famous person you might be able to put the spotlight on?
Uh, we're discussing it.
All right. It's
we have
personal, like I
plans.
want it to happen. So like I want an
Yeah.
entire bookshelf from you two, like the entire shelf filled.
Well, if the shelf, were only wide enough to accommodate 3 books, you might get your wish.
Is it when deciding on that? I'm not asking you to say like who you're talking about or what you're thinking of. Um, does the time period factor at all? Because it's kind of interesting. It almost feels like there's this you're moving a little bit ahead of time in some ways. Like I
Hmm.
think Gain happened before Wortham, right? Like date wise,
No, they were
Well,
actually the same
were they
time.
about somewhat contemporaries?
Yeah.
well, they overlap, but
The
I
Yeah.
mean,
50s.
Gaines'
Yeah.
crimes, were discovered in '57, which I think was a little which was after,
Okay.
the whole
Yeah.
comic book thing. But so no, I mean, I do think, that the period setting uh, is important to the experience of the graphic novels. I mean, it's one of the things, again, Eric's art captures so well. Um, so, yeah, I mean, we're not sort of looking, we're not making our choices based on chronological factors,
Yeah.
put it like that.
But I think I personally I gravitate towards that time period, kind of the mid-century to depression era time period. Just because it's I don't know. It has an aesthetic that I really love.
Mm-hmm.
I don't find a lot of interest in drawing modern things.
Mm-hmm.
So
Is there what type of research goes into that? Like, how much research do you do to get that time period right? And I mean, like for this sort of book, like what did you look into for clothing and maybe buildings and furniture and all that?
for
Like,
that time period, it's pretty easy because all you have to do is pick up a few, Life magazines, do a few Google searches, and there's a lot of photographic documentation of that time. And plus, I mean, film is pretty prominent, uh in that too. Uh, yeah.
Yes, we had photographs back in the 1950s.
Yeah. Way back then.
Yeah,
They even had movies.
yeah,
and final question. When you were doing the research, there's some really cool photos in the back from the Library of Congress of doing some of that research. How did it feel to like see those historical documents and maybe hold them in your hands and really like, I mean, there
yeah.
is something about touching it and really feeling
Yeah.
that history, right?
Oh,
There
yeah.
are two things that stuck out in my mind. One, I remember we pulled out this big folder, and I remember both of us standing over it and flipping it open, and kind of like I gasped. The original X-rays of Albert Fish's pelvis
Yep,
with the needles,
which is in the
and
book.
I was like, "Oh my God, I can't believe that's." It was a total surprise that it was there, and we have photos of Harold holding it up. Um, the other was a portrait of an anonymous artist drew um, when Wertham was like late teens to early 20s. I think it was dated 1913 or something like that. Um, and that's the moment that he kind of became a real human being to me.
Mhm.
That he was a kid. He was, and someone uh, took the time to draw his profile. And I was like, that really humanized him to me.
Mhm. Well, for me, and I'm just hoping nobody from the Library of Congress listens to this podcast. But to me, like you'd open a phone, there'd be like there was like an actual signed receipt from Sigmund Freud, uh, for his services rendered, and I was like, Eric, do you know how much this would be worth? And he had to forcibly restrain me from. But anyway, so yeah, so
I
there's
don't
that.
know what the consequences would be from lifting something at the Library of Congress, but I'm sure it's pretty severe.
Yeah.
I
Um,
will say, living in DC, that often comes across with the history. I mean, like, do you know how much this would go for on
yeah.
eBay? Yeah, there's something about being here and experiencing that.
Yeah,
Um,
we found all kinds of stuff like that. There were, uh, signed letters from Albert Fish and all this other stuff that would be like, collectors would go crazy over it. But I'm glad it's tucked away in the Library of Congress.
Yeah, they seem to take good care of that stuff.
Yeah.
oh yeah. Well, thank you both. I really appreciate it. Before we go, there's something I always like to do of allowing you both to plug something. So where people can find you online, any other projects you have coming up that you want people to check out, or other stuff that's been released.
Harold?
Oh, well, I'm not really a social media person, but if you Google me, things will come up. I do I do have a book coming out this September called 50 States of Murder, an atlas of American crime, which basically covers, let's say 5 to 7 murder cases in every state that have become part of the local lore, but, are not widely known by other people. So like for Wisconsin, I don't really do Ed Gein because everybody knows Ed Gein. These other very interesting cases, that have entered into the criminal annals of the state. So that's coming out in September, I believe.
Okay. Unfortunately, I have some projects coming that I can't talk about just yet, but there is a new Goon collection coming out relatively soon. I can't remember the release date, but the Goon Them That Don't Stay Dead collection is coming up pretty soon.
So thank you both. I really appreciate it. This is, as I said, I will keep
Thank you.
over. This is absolutely fantastic. For those who have not read it, go fix that. This is amazing. Well done, both, and I really appreciate your time. And thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for having us.
Yep.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.